Dr. Faisal Devji and friends, warm welcome to you. We are delighted to have Dr. Faisal Devji with us this afternoon, and he'll be speaking on Gandhi and the Gita. We are all very much looking forward to that. Now, Dr. Faisal Devji is the university reader in modern South Asian history and director, St. Anthony's College Asian Studies Center. He has held faculty positions at the New School in New York, Yale University, and the University of Chicago, from where he also received his PhD in intellectual history. He was junior fellow at the Society of Fellows, Harvard University, and head of graduate studies at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. Dr. Devji is a fellow at New York University's Institute of Public Knowledge, and he is Ottoman Chair at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. His writings are widely published, and he is the author of 4 excellent books: Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, Militant Islam and the Global Politics, Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality and Modernity, and of course one related to Gandhi, The Impossible India, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence. We are all looking forward to hear you, Dr. Faisal Devji. I invite you to take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very grateful to Usha-Ben Thakkar for inviting me to speak at this wonderful institution. It's a great privilege and honor to be here and to be speaking in a building where Gandhiji spent so much time. So my talk today, as you will know, is on Gandhi's views on the Bhagavad Gita, and I am particularly interested in his 1926 commentary on the Gita, which he delivered as a series of talks during the reading of the Gita at Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad. But let me begin by, I'm sorry, this is... Let me begin. Can you hear me without it?
I think you're loud enough.
Yeah. Can you hear me without it? Okay, so no? No, okay. Well, let's wait until they do something about it. Yeah?
Road to Gita is not easy.
Yes. There's always some difficulty involved. Good, so I think that's much better. So I thought I'd begin by saying something about how the Gita became a very important text in the 19th and 20th centuries for Indian thinkers more generally. Gandhiji, of course, is not the only one who writes about the Gita. Naturally, there were commentaries on the Gita for hundreds of years. But what's new about these commentaries that come out in the 19th and 20th centuries is that they have a very different focus. These commentaries, whether it is by Bankim in Bengal, whether it is by Swami Vivekanand, whether it is by Sri Aurobindo, whether it is by Lokmanya Tilak here, Gandhiji himself, and of course Vinoba Bhave. The thing about all of these commentaries on the Gita is that they seem, at least in part, to be attempts to think about India's future, India's political future. What does it mean in a colonial situation in which Indians have no political power to think about the future of Indian politics? How is it possible to create a kind of Indian subject, a new kind of Indian, to address the future of the country? And when these thinkers are looking at the Gita in order to reflect upon these questions, they do so invariably by making it clear that the Gita is a text for everybody. It is not concerned with any particular section, caste, or group. It is a universal text. And they all deal with it as a universal text. Now, we know Gandhiji himself, for instance, first really discovers the Gita when he's a student in London. He discovers it in in English translation, and then he goes to various Gujarati translations, and finally attempts to read it in Sanskrit, in his imperfect Sanskrit. And for him, this was never a problem, because for him, the Gita was not simply something that had to be confined to Sanskrit scholars. This was a universal text. It was a text you could approach in any language. It was a text which was part of a global conversation. Since it had been translated into English and other European languages, it was part of a global conversation about the nature of morality, of ethics, and of war. Because the Gita, of course, is a text which occurs on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. And this is another important point I want to make by way of introduction. Because unlike almost every other moral philosophy I can think of, for which morality ends where the battlefield begins. The moment war begins, their morality ends. There can be no morality in war. The Gita is not obviously a text of this kind. For the Gita, and for Gandhi in particular, morality has its place precisely on the battlefield. And his view is the following. If you exclude war, if you exclude the battlefield, in this case Kurukshetra, from moral life, then you have limited moral life, you have limited morality. If you have exceptionalized it to a certain part of life and not to another part of life, then it is not universal. So in order for moral life to be universal, it must be available and possible everywhere. And that everywhere includes the battlefield. And this, I think, is actually unique. I know of no Western moral theory which takes the battlefield seriously as a site of ethics. The battlefield is the limit. For Gandhi, and indeed for the Gita itself, the battlefield, Kurukshetra, is the very site of morality. Because he thinks morality, like the Gita itself, is a universal. And to be a universal, it must be accessible and available everywhere. So having said those few words by way of introduction, I also want to proceed and say something about how Gandhi views the Gita as opposed to other kinds of texts. Now, of course, the Gita is included as part of the Mahabharata, and it is, I need not tell you, but I will anyway, that it occurs at this fateful point of the Mahabharata, where this ancient text, this great epic, is reaching its culmination. Right? The two rival armies of the Kauravas and the Pandavas are drawn up on the battlefield. And the great hero Arjuna suddenly feels that he cannot follow through on this battle. And he gets his charioteer, Lord Krishna, to drive the chariot there into that no man's land between two armies. The position of the greatest neutrality, you might say. It's neither here nor there. It's nowhere. And yet that nowhere is also everywhere. Kurukshetra is our everywhere. Right? And as you know, he has Krishna stop the chariot, and his great bow falls from his hand, and he says, how can I kill my preceptors, my friends, my relations, with whom I have spent so many years? Why should I not simply retire from the battlefield? And Lord Krishna's advice to him is, he must fight. It is his duty to fight. And there follows, of course, a long and very abstruse, esoteric and rich discussion on Dharma, on the nature of Dharma. Now, I won't go into too much of that here. It would take far too long. But I just would like to say, before launching on Gandhi's commentary, how for Gandhi the Gita and the Mahabharata, of which it is a part, is important precisely because it cannot be seen as a history. Right? So Gandhi, as you might know, is for someone who distrusts history. Now, this is problematic for me since I'm a historian myself. But his reasons for distrusting history are very important. So when he says that the Gita is not history, or the Mahabharata is not history, he doesn't mean that it didn't happen. What he means is that history is a form of knowledge that in our times, that is to say in Gandhi's own time, was the form of knowledge that British colonialism used to justify the occupation of India, right? And they did so in the following manner, by saying, look, they never said we are going to conquer India and keep it just because we are strong. They always said, we conquer India and keep it so long as India is incapable of ruling herself. India is too divided, it's too diverse, and Indians have not yet gotten to that historical stage where they are capable of running their own affairs. So for India to actually be free, she needs to accomplish the work of history. She needs more history. She needs more time to fulfill her own mission. This was the primary justification for colonial rule. And Gandhi had always been against it. He said, no, we are ready. Everyone is already ready. No one needs to wait. This is not a question of being a child, where you need to grow into an adult in order to become mature enough to run your own affairs. So when he criticized history, what he was doing was criticizing the primary argument that colonial power used to justify her rule over India. He also did so for another reason. For him, history was a very dangerous form of thinking, form of consciousness. Because when you think historically, it becomes increasingly natural for you to identify with one side or the other in a historical debate or argument. Right? You will take the side of one party and you will despise and hate the other party. So for Gandhi, history, especially in colonial India, was a dangerous thing, not simply because it was used to justify colonialism, but also because he saw Indians themselves relying upon history and historical consciousness to divide themselves from their own fellow subjects, fellow Indians. It was the identification with history that he thought was very problematic. Right? Whereas he thought that epic, such as the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, what epic allows you to do is to think in a cool, dispassionate, detached, but also fully engaged and philosophical way about universal problems. So the thing about the Gita, we all know the story. I just told you a bit of it. But no one reads the Gita in order to hate the Kauravas. No one is so fully identified with the Pandavas that I know of no instance in which people will say, okay, I am like one of the Kauravas and you are like one of the I am like one of the Pandavas and you are like one of the Kauravas and therefore we must always fight. That there is no identification built in to epic truth in Gandhi's view. So for him, a text like the Mahabharata and therefore the Gita, which is its constituent part, is important because it is a properly philosophical text, in addition to being a spiritual text. It allows people to think about themselves, others, their own situation, their times, in a conceptual, philosophical, and spiritual way without identifying with it. So you can recognize that the Pandavas are virtuous and the Kauravas are not. But you don't have to feel any passion. You don't have to feel hatred. Epic knowledge, epic texts are, in this sense, non-violent, even if they narrate great violence. The Mahabharata is a text which tells us of great violence, but we are never moved to hatred by reading it. On the contrary, we are meant to feel, and do indeed, I think, feel reflective, meditative, and we are meant to learn from it. It's not meant to inflame or impassion us. This is another reason why, for Gandhi, a text like the Gita is so important. Now, let's go on right away then to the crux of the matter. I've described to you the initial stages of the Gita. Lord Krishna delivers Arjuna to that no man's land, which is where we all are in some ways, always present. And Arjuna says to himself and to his charioteer, What must I do? Now, this is the classic instance in Western political theory, in Western moral philosophy. It's the first question, or the most important question. What must I do? What choice should I make? And for Gandhi, this is an illegitimate question. So in his view, Arjuna has no choice. That is why Krishna tells him, you must simply follow your dharma. You must follow where your own past has brought you. Why is Gandhi so dubious about choice, which is the principal category of European moral thought? Choice. Should I make this choice or that choice? Gandhi doesn't like choice for many reasons. One, because choice he thinks is fundamentally anti-democratic. How can that be? He thinks it's elitist because choice depends upon knowledge, which means that if you are a very educated man, let's say, and you come from a rather wealthy background that has allowed you to be educated, you can make a better choice than an illiterate woman. Right? So any moral philosophy based upon choice for Gandhi necessarily is hierarchical. It destroys the equality of people, and it means that some people are more moral than other people. Not because they are more virtuous, but because they have a better education, because they have a wealthier background, because they are men as opposed to women or children. And he thinks that this way of considering morality is fundamentally wrong, because it is anti-democratic, because it excludes people from morality, and it means that morality is only in the possession of those who have the luxury of education or who have the luxury of knowledge. And this, of course, would destroy the universality of ethics and therefore of the Gita itself. Right? So he has this extraordinary critique of choice, which, as I said, is the fundamental principle of European political thought. More than choice being elite or anti-democratic, it is, he thinks, impossible in various ways. That you can never be in a position to make a fully informed choice. You can never know all the factors behind an event. You can never know what goes into the making of a situation. Arjuna himself does not know does not know fully the background that brought himself to the battlefield of Kurukshetra. So no one can make an absolutely informed choice. And that is another reason why choice is impossible. It is also, says Gandhi, superfluous. So when Arjuna is there at Kurukshetra, in Gandhi's view, Lord Krishna tells him, what is it that you are doing when you say you don't want to fight? It's not the fact that you don't want to fight. You think you have a choice, but you don't have a choice. Your choice has been rendered superfluous. And Gandhi in his commentary says, look, Lord Krishna tells Arjuna, whether you stay and fight or you go, this battle is going to happen. What you decide will have no bearing on it. Okay, if you don't fight, maybe one side will win and another side will lose. But people will get killed anyway, including your own friends, relations, and preceptors. So you are placing too much weight on your choice. Your choice is actually superfluous. You don't have a choice. So there are three forms of critique here, right? One is that choice is elitist, it's anti-democratic, and it's not universal. The second is that choice is impossible because no one can be fully informed. No one can make a fully informed choice. And thirdly, that choice is superfluous, at least for Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. So if you can't decide on your moral action on the basis of choice, how are you to act? That is the great question. And for Gandhi, of course, you must act according to your dharma. You must act not according to choice, not by saying, if I act this way, then this will happen, or if I act that way, then that will happen. That's not right. You can only make a decision on the basis of your dharma by discovering what your dharma is, your duty. Right? And dharma is always Swadharma. It's always your individual duty. This, again, is crucial. So if I'm using Western or European moral thought as my foil here, I would say that in European moral thought, you don't really have fully developed, this kind of idea of Swadharma, right? Because modern European moral thought especially always wants to construct a generic moral subject, right? A generic subject, so that the person who acts could be anyone, X. It could be you, it could be me, it could be someone else. For Gandhi, this is not right. Such a person does not exist. There is no generic moral figure. There is no generic actor. Every person is very specific. You can only act depending on your circumstances, depending on who you are. All right? So men and women have their own dharmas. Children and adults have their own dharmas. The rich, the poor, the middle classes have their own dharma, etc. Right? So the dharma is different for everyone. Your task as a moral actor is then to discover what your dharma is by reflecting upon who you are, where you are. Arjuna is on the battlefield. He has been brought there by a long series of causes. He cannot now leave. He has to fight. He's been brought there. He's been fully complicit in all the actions that have brought him there. Now he cannot say, I don't want to fight. His dharma is to fight. He's also a Kshatriya. His duty is to fight. Right. Now, Gandhi reflects upon the nature of Swadharma in all kinds of ways. And I'll give you one example in which your dharma is different depending on who you are. So he's talking about himself, or he's talking about, so he says, if you are someone from an upper caste, your dharma towards others shifts, right? So your duty towards a lower caste person must be seva, service, right? But the duty between, say, Hindus and Muslims must be mitrata, friendship, because they are equals, right? With caste, it's a different relationship. So seva with one and mitrata with the other. So this is simply an example of the way in which, with the same person, your dharma differs depending on the relations that are involved. He also thought that it was Swadharma, it was the distinctiveness of dharma that made Swaraj possible, that made self-rule possible. All right, and Gandhi reflects upon this during the non-cooperation movement, right, from 1919 to 1922. And he says, look, India is under colonial rule. How are Indians to unite against it? We don't occupy the state. The state is run by someone else, by the English. Now, normally people are united through the state, right? Because you identify with the government, because you owe loyalty to the state, that you can unite as citizens. In this case, that's not possible, because you're fighting against that state. So how are you to unite? He says it's only because Indians are already divided into various kinds of groups, castes and communities and guilds and all kinds of things, right? Languages and regions and many things. Now, this was seen as a weakness. This diversity was seen as a weakness. For Gandhi, it's a strength not simply on moral grounds, but on very pragmatic political grounds as well. He says it's only because we have caste and community and language and all of these things, which all have their problems, but nevertheless, we have them and we can reform them. It's only because we can already organize ourselves in these ways, each according to his or her own dharma, that we can non-cooperate. India already knows how to rule herself because she rules herself. Each village rules itself, each caste rules itself, each community rules itself in various ways. So it is that very diversity that allowed Indians to withdraw cooperation from the Raj. Right? So for him, this too is an example of Swadharma at a collective level. That doesn't mean it's always good, but it's always necessary in his view. So Swaraj is only possible in that way. And famously, Gandhi says in his first major text, Hind Swaraj, he says Swaraj is such a thing that if you once you realize you have it, you have it right away. It's in your hand. It's in the palm of your hand. You don't need to wait for it. All you need to do is recognize that you have it, and you're already free. Then the independence of India can come. But you will not be free only with the independence of India. Your freedom comes first. It is immediate. And in this way, too, he's a critic of history, right? Because everyone else is saying, no, you must wait for 20, 50, 100 years before you can be free. He says, whether the British go or stay, first you must become free. And one way of becoming free is withdrawing cooperation. Right? You have already achieved your freedom. Your freedom is immediate. It doesn't have to wait for the British to leave. That, of course, is something that is desired. But that should never hold up your freedom. Now, the thing about duty, because Dharma, of course, is what we are talking about, is that for Gandhi, it is a more crucial moral category than the one that is popular today and indeed in his own time, the idea of right. Right? So normally you have rights and duties, and people tend to fight for rights, and it's a good thing they fight for rights. But I'm reminded of the fact that I think in 1946, Julian Huxley, who was at that time director of UNESCO, writes to Gandhiji. And he's writing to Gandhi because the United Nations, of course, is drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Right? So, and they want the views of eminent figures such as the Mahatma. And Gandhi's on the train somewhere, Wardha, somewhere. And he writes back on the train, Wardha, something. And he says to Huxley, I'm really not so fond of rights. Right? I think duties are the primary thing. It is not rights, it's duties. Now, why does he say this? He says, the thing about rights is that they can only be given by the state. You may call them inalienable. You may think that rights belong to people inherently and that no one can take them away. But in fact, rights are always being taken away. You may have the right to life and to security and to property, but those might be just fictive. You don't actually have them. It is the state that gives you rights. So for Gandhi, rights are not inalienable. They actually put you in a situation of dependency vis-a-vis the state. But duties are inalienable. No one can take away your duty. The state can take away your rights. Your duty belongs to you alone. No one can take it away from you. And you are responsible to that duty. Right? So there's never a time when you don't have a duty. But there are many times where you don't have rights. So though he's not against rights, he thinks duty is the primary moral category. Thus the importance of Dharma. Dharma is crucial. Right? It trumps rights in this sense. Because it belongs, like the idea of Swadharma, it belongs only to you. And you can never escape it. You are obligated to it, to that duty. So, this, so far as Gandhiji's views on Dharma and Swadharma are concerned. That is to say, Arjuna's dilemma. What is he to do? Another question that arises in this connection is, of course, how non-violence is possible. Right? You may be right, someone might have said to Gandhi, that, duties are more important than rights, that Swadharma belongs to each person individually, that the diversity of dharmas is what makes Swaraj possible, that choice is not the crucial category, but the duty is the crucial category. But what does that actually tell us about non-violence? And this is what he says in this commentary of 1926. He says, evil depends upon goodness. Right? We think that goodness and evil are different things. And they are different things, but they're intertwined and interconnected in a very interesting way. How is that? He says, look at the army of Duryodhana, at the Kaurava army. How does it hold together? How does that army keep together? Duryodhana might be evil. He might be doing everything in the most selfish way possible. But he cannot control an army on that principle, on that basis. An army necessarily relies upon loyalty, courage, bravery, faithfulness, all of these things, friendship. If these virtues, and they are virtues, do not exist, then no army can hold together. No society can exist without these virtues. For a society to exist, there has to be friendship, there has to be loyalty, there has to be sacrifice, there has to be courage. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist, would it? So Gandhi's argument is, you think Duryodhana controls his army, but in fact he doesn't control his army. His army holds together because they are attached to each other by virtues, right? Because they have friendship. Look, for instance, at the virtuous people in his army. Bhishma, Drona, Karna. They are not there because they are evil, they are good. They are there because they have made a promise, because they have friendships, because they have loyalty. It is precisely because evil depends upon goodness that evil can be converted into goodness. If they were radically opposed, you couldn't do that. So non-cooperation, what that means is you withdraw the goodness out of the evil and the evil will collapse. Right? So non-cooperation means you recognize the virtue even in your enemy and you withdraw it. And if you withdraw it, then it cannot survive. Right? And throughout his life, Gandhiji gives many examples of this. A very important one comes just before the Second World War. So from 1937 to 1939, you have some eminent Jewish figures in Europe writing to Gandhi, saying, what shall we do? Now, at that time, remember, in Europe and in America, the plight of the Jews is of not great consideration. It does not shape the war. To the very end, no power, no European power, nor America actually did anything to save the Jews. On the contrary, they were constantly denying them entry as refugees and things like that. We see the situation going on again today in Europe. So you have these Jewish intellectuals writing to Gandhi and say, what shall we do? And Gandhi says the following. It's a difficult thing to say, but he says this. He says, what you must understand is that like Duryodhana, Hitler might be completely evil, but the German army cannot hold together if it doesn't have virtues within it. So what you must do is to prove that you are more courageous, you are braver, you are more loyal, etc. than they are. You must prove that you are better Germans. Instead of hating them because they are Germans, you must say, I am the true German and you are the false German. Right? I represent Germany, Hitler does not represent Germany. How are you to do this? He said, if you cannot fight, if you cannot escape from Germany, if you have no choice, like Arjuna has no choice in Kurukshetra, he cannot run away, he must stay. If you can flee, flee. If you can fight, fight. If you can't fight, then what you must do is, even if you are taken to your death, you must go in a public manner. You must go in a non-violent manner. You must not allow yourself to be taken away in the middle of night, and do not go unresisting. You must resist not violently, obviously. You must resist in such a way as to show your own captors and to show everyone around, all your neighbors, that you are the one who is truly courageous. You are the one who is truly brave. You are the one who is truly loyal to Germany. And if you do this, even if 2 or 3 people are converted, that will make all the difference in the world. Because then even the Germans, your enemies, in future generations will be able to take comfort from the fact that you were the best of Germans, that Germany's name has not been sullied in vain, that there were true Germans among us at this awful hour, and these were the Jews. Right? So it's a very difficult piece of advice to give a population that is facing extinction, though of course in this period, 37 to 39, the decision to exterminate the Jews had not yet been taken. Right? And people weren't really talking apart from the Jews themselves. It was not part of great politics, great power politics. Gandhi was prescient. He realized that the victimization of the Jews was going to be a crucial part of the war before anyone else realized it. Right? And the advice he gives them comes straight out of the Gita, comes straight out of his interpretation of the Gita, which he makes in 1926. He makes it in 1926. In 1937 to 39, he's now laying it out. Right. So that is an example of how duty, and sacrificial duty in particular, works, because evil depends upon goodness. Right? So sacrifice then is the ultimate form of duty. The ultimate withdrawal of cooperation is sacrifice. And here I will give you another anecdote, again from the same period of the beginning of the war. This is 1937, just before the war begins. So one of Hitler's acolytes, a newspaper editor called von Strunk, comes to India to see Gandhi. He had been in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, supporting the fascists in Spain. And for some reason, he's greatly troubled by and fascinated by Gandhi. So he comes all the way to India to see him. And we have a record of the conversation, which is very interesting. And he says to Gandhi, he wants to talk about Gandhi's views on health and such matters. And Gandhi says to him, much to his surprise, he says, look, the thing I want Indians to learn from Europe, you know how to throw away your lives. You are willing to go to war and die for a cause. That is a noble thing. That is a good thing. The problem is that there's a contradiction between wanting to throw away your lives. You can do it so easily. You can sacrifice, but you also want to save your life. That is the contradiction. I want to learn from you how to throw away my life in the service of a good cause. I don't want to learn how to save life. I mean, obviously he doesn't want people to die just for the sake of dying. But he says, the violence comes not from your desire to sacrifice. The violence comes from your desire to preserve your own life. And there is a contradiction. So Strunk is talking to Gandhiji about health. And Gandhi says to him, look, how can you at the same time make war and throw away your life, and also seek by medicinal means to save lives? All right. Especially that saving of life is performed in such a way as to kill subhuman life, animals. You vivisect animals, you kill animals in your experiments, and you think that this is a good thing, that you're discovering medicinal procedures, medical procedures to save lives. There is a fundamental contradiction here. What is valuable is sacrifice. This is what I want to learn from Europe. So this man, of course, is completely flabbergasted. He really doesn't know what to think. And he goes back to Germany, and 2 months later, he dies in a duel. He has a duel with someone. And it's almost as if, how can I tell? But it's almost as if he's taken Gandhi's words to heart, and he literally sacrifices himself in this most chivalric of procedures, the duel. After which Hitler bans the duel. All right. So you might read Gandhi's influence in all of this if you want, as I do, though of course I cannot demonstrate it. Now, this focus on sacrifice is crucial, because what happens in it is Gandhi takes yajna, the sacrifice, the ritual sacrifice, and makes it a kind of balidan, makes it a sacrifice of yourself. Right? And this he thinks is important, because it's both quotidian and exceptional. People said to him, what do you mean sacrifice yourself? And Gandhiji did this often himself, right? He put himself in harm's way in the great Calcutta riots, in the run-up to partition in Calcutta, right, in 46, 47. He fasts unto death on more than one occasion. He puts his life at risk, right? And people, of course, have always said, they said it to him and they say it now. Oh, but this is very exceptional. Only Gandhiji could do such a thing. And Gandhi says, no, actually everyone can do it. Everyone does do it. He said, I cannot think of a single family in which parents and children are not willing to sacrifice themselves for each other, in which husbands and wives and lovers are not willing to sacrifice. He said, we see it every day. We see it every day in front of us. Every family has this. What I want to do, he says, is to generalize this. The question is not that people can't do it because it's too noble. The question is, why is it not more widespread? All right. What is holding us back? sacrifice is crucial, it's quotidian, he thinks it's entirely possible, and his great heroes are all heroes of sacrifice. Harishchandra, who is willing to sacrifice his wife and son. Rama, who is willing to sacrifice his wife and to some indirect degree his two sons. Right? Prahlad, who in effect sacrifices his father. It's a curious sacrifice because you normally have the father sacrificing the son. Here you have the son sacrificing the father. Right? And there are others. Gandhi writes a translation of Plato's Apology, which is about the death of Socrates. Socrates chooses to die. He will not lie. He drinks the cup of hemlock. He dies deliberately, even though he has a choice not to die. And for that, Gandhi thought this was noble. So he actually does a Gujarati translation of it, from an English translation, of course. And yet again, as in so many other instances, this vision of sacrifice comes to have a quite severe and very interesting reality in his own times. And I'll give you two examples of that. So as you know, the Gita, the sacrifice of the Gita is a sacrifice of your own, right? That's why Arjuna is so hesitant, because he has to kill his own friends and his own relations and his own preceptors. And there are two occasions around the time of partition when Gandhi sees the same situation playing out in India. One is Calcutta, which I have mentioned. Right? And in Calcutta, you have a situation where Gandhiji has gone around and said, look, there were communal riots going on, and he gets promises from the militant organizations on both sides to say, you will permit the return of those whom you have chased out. Right? And in one neighborhood, there is a Hindu militant unit, and they make a promise to Gandhi. And then, this is a story told in Nirmal Kumar Bose's wonderful book, My Days with Gandhi. And Bose says that one of these figures comes to him and tells him, look, we have promised Gandhiji that we will protect the Muslims who are here. But there are many of our own brothers who will not listen to us. So what we need to do is we need weapons in order to defend the people we have promised to defend. And Bose thinks that Gandhiji will not agree, because how could he agree that someone should have weapons? And when Gandhiji is told, he says immediately, I am delighted, of course they should have weapons. Now, notice that risk involved, because it's absolute trust that is the issue here. How did he know that these people are not going to use the weapons against these Muslims? But for Gandhi, of course, it's the trust that matters. That is the test. That is, it puts a kind of unbearable pressure on the person you trust. And of course, he sees this at instance of the Gita. Here are people willing to kill their own brothers, their own relations, to honor their promise. It's like the world of the Gita come alive again. Right? The other situation at the same time happens in Kashmir. So in Kashmir, as you know, when the Pakistani funded rebels and troops invade, there is a resistance movement which is led at that time by Sheikh Abdullah. And people are saying to Gandhi, oh, but there's war. And Gandhi says, but this is good. Kashmir might be the lamp that lights up the whole of India. How? Because there it is the Muslims of Kashmir who are willing to kill their own brothers to defend the Hindus and the Sikhs there. And that is another instance of the Gita's teachings. Now, these are all rather troubling and severe examples, but they are very interesting because they show you that whether Gandhi was right or wrong, he sees his teachings, he sees what he understands as the teachings of the Gita to be available to him in everyday life. Even in these exceptional circumstances, the Gita is always there, ready and present. It's not just to think about. It allows you to think in a rich way, but it insists upon being put into practice. It's not just there to admire. Moral life must actually be a practical life. It can't just be an aesthetic one. Right? So, let's move on then to the third theme, and there are only four that I want to speak about today. which has to do with breaking the chain of karma. All right. So this, as you know, is the crucial thing. How do you act in such a way that the consequences of your act do not rebound upon you, that you're not tied up in the chains of karma? For Gandhi, nishkam karma, the detached action, is one that has to therefore break the chain of cause and effect. Because if your acts are caught up in causality, cause and effect, then you will never escape from it. How do you act in such a way as to disallow the rebounding of your action against itself? Now, Gandhi generally speaks about this in terms of means and ends. So, as you know, there is an entire set of moral principles for which ends determine means, right? So, in other words, if your end is a virtuous or noble end, then you can use whatever means you can to achieve it, even if these include violence. For Gandhi, it's exactly the opposite. You must not concern yourself with the ends. It's the Gita's teaching. You must not consider the fruits of your action. You must consider only the means. If you consider the means, which are no longer means because they are not there for any end, if you consider the nature of your action in its own right, according to your Dharma, then the ends will take care of themselves. You must have that kind of trust, just as he put trust in those militants I spoke about a moment ago. And that is how you break the chain, the karmic chain. But he has other arguments for this as well. He says, look, we think that we are acting on behalf of an end, but we cannot really ever control that end. This is a similar argument to the one that he deploys, which I described earlier, on choice, on knowledge, right? No one is so full of knowledge about the end that they can ascertain it rightly, right? So you may think that you're acting in such a way as, so you fight a war and you will have victory at the end. But as the Gita tells us, as the Mahabharata tells us, the Pandavas did win a victory. But what was the cost of that victory? The end of the Mahabharata is a tragic end. You know what happens to the Pandavas, right? Their race is ended. So it's a tragic war. Victory, even if you do achieve victory, you cannot predict the untoward consequences of that victory. So for Gandhi, the people who think they're very practical and pragmatic, they said, well, we need to do that. In order to do that, we will do the following. He thinks that never works because no one ever knows everything about a situation. No one can fully predict what's going to happen. So even if you do achieve your end, like the end of the Mahabharata, that end can be a very different kind of end than you would have thought it to be. Right? And that this way of thinking about the end, about the consequences, is completely idealistic, therefore. Right? It's basically predicting the future. It's mortgaging your present to the future. Right? And that, he thinks, is an unsuitable way of doing ethics. And I'll give you two brief examples of this, both from Hind Swaraj. So Hind Swaraj is a dialogue between an editor and a reader. And the reader is sometimes seen to be the figure of the militant or the anarchist militant, right, who wants to free India by violence. And Gandhi says famously to him, so you want the tiger's nature without the tiger, right? If all you want to do is take over from the British and behave just like the British, then let the British remain. They know how to be British better than we know how to be British. So then just keep them. They operate by violence, therefore you must not operate by violence. If you just want to take their place, then what worth is independence? Independence is only worthwhile if we are doing something different than what they are doing. We don't just want to make India like Britain. We have something else for the world. India's mission is a different mission for the world. It's not just for us. It's for the whole world, right? So this is one way in which he criticizes those who are obsessed by creating a new kind of future, by sacrificing means for ends. The other example from Swaraj, of course, is that of the thief, right? So one of the arguments that the reader gives is to say, look, India is like a house. A thief has broken into our house. Should we not fight and resist the thief? And Gandhi gives many very peculiar, sometimes, and interesting arguments about this. For instance, he says, what if the thief is your father? What will you do? Will you be really ashamed and embarrassed and pretend to be asleep and let your father? So by just shifting the argument, he completely transforms it. But the more elaborate argument he gives, of course, is if you begin a task by employing violence, then it will only escalate. The thief will then come back tomorrow with his associates. Then you will have to have more people of your neighbors to protect you. Then there's an escalation on both sides. And so what you wanted to do initially, which is to remain secure and to free yourself from fear, the opposite will have been achieved. You will have more violence and more fear. Right? So these ways of shaping the future, of determining the future, he thinks are improper and indeed idealistic. For him then, it is not the future that should determine moral action. It is the present. Right? The present, he thinks, is the great site of ethics. So the thing about Nishkam Karma is that you must not consider yourself for the fruit. The fruit is in the future. You cannot predict that. You must consider yourself your present. Because he thinks that people live so much for the future that they don't understand themselves in the present. They're unable to live properly in their present because they sacrifice their present all the time. But the future never comes. The future never comes in the way that you want it to come. Right? So when making this argument, he has two, I think, really interesting things to say. One is that by not seeking to control the future, what you are doing is you are attending upon the divine incarnation. The future is incalculable. There are many things about the future which you cannot calculate. You cannot know. No one can know. What you must do is again trust. In this case, if you are truly religious, you trust in the divine. His point is, if you are trying to control the future so much, God will never come. God will never incarnate. The avatar will never appear. The avatar only appears when you prepare the way for him, when you attend to the present and you leave the future open. When you leave the future open, many more possibilities emerge, when you're not trying to control it all the time. Right? And that is the moment when God incarnates himself. Right? So for him, there's a specific religious reason as well, that when you're trying to control the future all the time, you are blocking the way for the avatar. You're blocking the way for the avatar, and you're blocking the way for God. Right? You must attend to the incalculable. You cannot control everything. The other interesting aspect of his argument is that if living in the present is so important, then the child, he thinks, is the true moral agent. Now again, notice Gandhiji is always doing this. He's always taking an idea and turning it on its head. Right? So now normally in moral philosophy you say the true moral agent is an adult, well-informed and generally a man. Right? That's how it is. In Plato and all of these people, it's generally a man and it's generally an adult. It's someone who has sufficient support, education, wealth, etc. Who knows better than other people, and who is free. Right? Free from attachments. For Gandhi, it's precisely the child, because the child lives in the present for him. The child is occupied only with things that are there. Right? And you might dismiss this as being puerile, but for Gandhi, the child is able to play with a leaf or a flower for hours because he or she sees something in it. They understand and inhabit the world in a much deeper way than adults do. They are free precisely because they are dependent, right? Because their parents are there to take care of them, because their teachers are there to take care of them, they don't have to worry about the future. So for Gandhi, the ideal moral being, I'm sure it's tongue-in-cheek in some ways, is the child. But he just turns around a very commonsensical way of thinking about morality and says, you think it's the adult male who is the ideal moral subject? No, it is the child. the consummate child, the perfect child, of course, is Lord Krishna himself as a child. Right? So, all these things are connected up in very interesting ways. How can you worship Krishna as a child if you think that only adults are important and moral subjects? But the Krishna who is loved most is the child Krishna. Right? Now, dependency, therefore, is freedom. He turns it around. So let me end then by saying a few words only about the life of Karma Yoga. Right? As you know, the Gita has different Jnana Yoga and Bhakti and all that. And all of these are important. But for Gandhi, like many of his associates at the time, Karma Yoga is crucial precisely because India is colonized at the time. They have to think about a theory of action. And the terrorists are thinking about terrorist actions. Gandhi is there to think about non-violent action. Action is crucial. And it's crucial precisely because Indians don't have control over their own selves, of their own freedom. Gandhi realizes that in order to have a truly ethical and desirable form of freedom, you have to ground yourself first. Right? Otherwise, if the terrorists win, India's future will be indescribable. It will be just as bad, if not worse, than colonialism. Just because they're brown faces and not white faces, as he says in Hind Swaraj, that is not an appreciable difference. So for him, and for all his practices, training the self in freedom, making Karma Yoga possible is crucial. And you know how he does this. If you think about, say, two of his most famous experiments, since he liked that word so much. One is spinning. Spinning. Now, you might think spinning is only there to produce cloth. He never makes an argument for it just on that basis. It's not just there so you can produce, if you want to produce cloth, you can just have factories and they'll produce cloth. No, spinning is there for a very important reason. Spinning is something that everyone can do. Again, it's democratic. Everyone can spin, right? Man, woman, and child. And yet everyone does it individually at the same time. So it's collective and individual at the same time. So you're not creating, because it's about creating your Swadharma and yourself, right? See, there are forms of collective identity in which the individuality of each is lost. And Gandhi doesn't like that. He thinks then you'd actually lose yourself. So spinning is something that millions of people can do at the same time, but they also must do it individually. And he says in the 1920s, if you spin, you will get Swaraj. And people are saying, what do you mean? How is this possible? It's possible because spinning is a form of withdrawal as well. He says, there, again in this commentary of the Gita, on that side where the British are, that's Bhoga Bhumi. That's the realm of enjoyment and consumption. This is Karma Bhumi, right? Spinning is a form of withdrawal because the British don't know what to do with this. Suddenly everyone is spinning. Like what? How are you going to make this illegal? What are you going to do with this? You withdraw from the evil system, right? And you're training yourself, you're creating your own selves through spinning. It's a form of action. It's laborious. Everyone must labor. All right? Everyone can do it. It makes a nation possible. Right? And it's sacrificial at the same time. The other way, of course, famous example is that of the Salt March. Now, again, the Salt March, you might think it's a collective action, but it's also highly individual. Because if you've ever seen, these sort of video clips, film of the Salt March, you will realize that Gandhi, again, it's something that how can you even ban it? So people were saying to Gandhi, what do you mean salt tax? That's nothing. That's a minor thing. No one cares about the salt tax. Why do you not focus on something big? But Gandhi realizes that often it is the small things that make something big. Right? It's things that seem very peculiar and strange, like spinning. Right? The terrorists will say, let's assassinate someone. And Gandhi says, no, let's spin. Salt March. How does it happen? He walks, people join and then they go, other people join and then they go. It's not like an army marching, right? it's individuals coming and going. Some accompany him all the way, some accompany him part of the way. Everyone can join in. And it's a way of creating a collective identity through a specific practice without regimenting them. So here too you have these forms of practice which are in fact about making Swaraj possible. You control your own self, and you do it individually and together at the same time, because each person has their own Swadharma. Right? And in doing so, of course, you destroy that causality that I was describing earlier. It's precisely because salt tax seems to be a kind of strange, weird thing, or that spinning doesn't seem to have a particularly important role, that they are important. Because then you're doing it for the present. You're not doing it to create some future only. Right? You're doing it, if it was about, okay, if we do, Gandhi often says if we spin, we'll get Swaraj. By which he didn't necessarily mean that India will become free politically. It means that we ourselves first have to be free as individuals in order for India to become free. And it's precisely because salt on the one hand or spinning cloth on the other do not seem to be such important causes that they can break the chain of karma. They can break the chain of cause and effect. Right? They have become practices, moral practices in their own right. I will end then by returning to where we began, the battlefield of Kurukshetra. If the battlefield is not the limit of ethics, if the battlefield is not the limit of morality, but is the site of moral action, then of course violence cannot be avoided. Right? So Gandhiji's view on non-violence is not that you must, that violence has nothing to do with non-violence, you must keep it aside and avoid it. Because that is simply to go into a state of retirement. When people say to him often in his career, they say, if you're a Mahatma, you go retire to Banaras or you go to the Himalayas and you stand there in the Ganges and you stop speaking and, you should be that. You should be a sadhu. And he says, no, my role is in the world. Right? That today in our time, this is what religion means. We have to deal with the world. So non-violence is not about avoiding violence. It is about converting violence into its opposite. So Gandhi is not people think he's an idealist in the negative sense, but he's not. What he does is he realizes that violence is inevitable. And he says very often, look, our lives are all about violence. Life itself is a form of violence because as we live, we destroy our own body. We grow older and we eventually die. He says blinking your eyelid is a form of violence. Procreation is a form of violence. Walking, all of these. Now, you see where this is coming from. It's coming from Jainism on the one hand and Buddhism on the other. But he's transforming these views. Right? So you cannot avoid violence. What you can do is to break that karmic chain by transforming violence and converting it into its opposite. So you must somehow absorb it. You cannot run away from it. So his is a philosophy of courage. It's not about avoidance. Right? And how do you do this? Well, I've described some instances to you of it before. But let me end by describing a particularly egregious instance of it. 1948. 1948 is the first war with Pakistan. And Gandhi is much misunderstood. Right? So Gandhi is against Pandit Nehru taking the case to the United Nations. Right? He says Nehru should not have done this. Why? Because this is a matter between us and the Pakistanis. If we invite other people to participate in this matter, we abstract from our own responsibility. We involve the international community. Once you internationalize a conflict like that, we lose sovereignty. Both India and Pakistan will lose sovereignty. We'll lose the capacity to act morally. And this great subcontinent will become the site of proxy wars forever. And indeed that has happened. Right? That, in fact, you can see has happened. Without this war, without the partition and the war, I doubt we would not have had the war in Afghanistan and the war on terror and all of these things. Right? So Gandhi's view is, do not internationalize this conflict, because then we evade and escape responsibility. Right? Instead of asking the UN to come and put us on hold, which he thinks is impossible. He thinks that international mediation, all it will do is just abate the violence by a bit and make it manageable. It will never resolve it. And no doubt he is correct, in my view. Right? He said we must deal directly with our enemy. And if we cannot achieve a resolution through negotiation, then we should go to war. And people were saying, what? Gandhiji is saying to go to war? What do you mean? Now, in the discussion that follows this talk, and I'm just about to end, we can talk more about, if you're interested, his views on war, because he has interesting views on the First World War and the Second World War as well. But his reasoning is the following. He says this even before partition. He said, I would rather have a civil war than have the partition of India. A civil war is preferable because with a civil war, at least we ourselves will come to some kind of resolution. The problem is that the British are here as a third party. And for too long, Indians have been used to using the British against each other. One side will try to get the British to support them, another side will get their work through. It needn't be the British, it could be anyone in the state. The problem is not to go through the state. The problem is to resolve. The only moral way to act is to try to resolve the problem between the people concerned. And that might be violent or it might be non-violent. The violence can also be non-violent if it is a form of violence that is meant to convert itself into its opposite. So just as you cannot live without violence, so too sometimes non-violence requires what appears to be violent means. And for Gandhi, let us remember, the key principle, as I've tried to suggest earlier, is not the virtue, it's not life. It's truth. Satya is his crucial principle. So truth must determine it, not life. That's why he's willing to sacrifice. It's a difficult creed to hold, but it is one that I would like to end with because it goes directly to the Gita. After all, you might ask yourself, why would Gandhi, the apostle of non-violence, see so much value in a text which counsels violence, which counsels war? Because Lord Krishna asks Arjuna to fight. And this, I think, is one reason why. Because you cannot avoid violence, but you can convert it. The thing to do is to sterilize it, as he used to say. And this is possible only if what is fundamental to you is not necessarily saving lives, but is truth. Satya is as in Satyagraha, of course, is the crucial category for Gandhi's politics and morality. So let me end there. Thank you very much.
I'm sure some of us have some questions after listening to this excellent lecture. Could have some questions.
I am sure Gandhiji must have had something to say about the just war theory, which was very prevalent at the time. And if you look at it carefully, it's really impossible to have a just war, because one of the conditions is to love your neighbor, to love your enemy. Has Gandhi commented on that? Because it's never taken seriously. It develops in the West, it's never followed in the West. It's something that's put aside.
No, you're right. And there, he struggles throughout his life with how to deal with war, right? And obviously he doesn't want it and he doesn't like it. But sometimes you are put in a position where it's unavoidable, just as in the Gita. Arjuna is put into that position. And as I said, for Gandhi, since morality is universal, it must also be possible in the battlefield. So in the First World War, for instance, he was returning from South Africa to India. He stops 1914, just as the war is declared, he arrives in London. Right? and he's there and he raises an ambulance. He's trying to raise an ambulance corps for service on the Western Front, just as he had done in South Africa over the course of 2 wars. And Gandhi's reasoning for this is very interesting. He says, look, whether I like it or not, since I'm living in England, I depend upon the Royal Navy. My security depends upon violence. Now, how am I to deal with this situation? I must recognize it. If I can live in London and go about my business and claim to be non-violent and yet depend upon violence, then I must cauterize that violence. Right? So what can I do? Either I go to furthest Scotland and live on grass, he says. I don't have the courage to do that. Or I recognize that I am depending on violence and I try to neutralize that violence and convert it into its opposite. How do I do that? If I raise an ambulance corps of Indians to go to France, we will put our lives at risk. We are not going to kill anyone. We want to cater, we want to minister to the wounded and the dead of both sides. Right? But so I am participating in this war in as non-violent a way as I can. But I don't have a choice. Like Arjuna, I do not have a choice. Because either I go and eat grass in Scotland, or I do this. Because I am dependent on violence, and I must recognize that. So he has very harsh words for those who pretend to be, oh, I would never touch, I would never do this, I'm a pacifist. Gandhi is not a pacifist. He's an advocate of non-violence, but he's not. You should not confuse that with pacifism. When he returns to India, he's also trying to recruit soldiers for the war. Remember, all right, in 1916 to 18, say 1918 basically, he goes and he's not very successful at doing it. And people have thought, oh, how could Gandhi do this? But he has very good reasons for doing it. And they're complicated ones. And he'll say things like, by showing our sacrifice, by being willing to sacrifice, we fit ourselves out for our own freedom. And the British are always saying to us, you're not ready. Well, let us claim this. So again, India is already at war. The British decided India was at war. The British got all these soldiers to go. So Gandhi's position is, we must own this war. We must not just be the passive instruments of war. We must say, okay, it's unavoidable. India is already at war. We don't have a choice. So we must do our duty like Arjuna did his duty. We must take this war situation and transform it from the inside. Right? By doing so willingly, but for our dharma, our dharmic reasons, not for theirs. Then it becomes something that gives us Swaraj. Right? It also trains us, it equips us for freedom, it allows us to understand the nature of evil and violence. It puts us to the test. It does many things. Right? So he's trying to transform even that inevitability into a form of moral action. So there are many instances of this throughout his career which have woefully been misunderstood, I think.
I would like to address the first part of your lecture where you began with, I don't know whether this is Gandhiji's thinking as such, but you made a distinction, and I'd like to make 2 points about what you said there. The first is you talked about the Western approach as having history, and history is always a text, and every text has intentionality, whether it is of the author or of the text itself. I cannot think of even an epic that is written without an intentionality. That's the first point that I made. And the second point that I would like a little clarification about is, when you talk about ethics as restricting itself to certain areas in terms of the West, whereas in Kurukshetra you are saying it is extended into the realm of violence, and it tries to make sense of that. I'm not so sure that I would agree with that, and the reason is because the whole point of hermeneutics is left out of consideration. And if you take hermeneutics into account, hermeneutics and history, they in a way balance each other. That's how the West has approached it. Would you like to?
Yes, well, thank you very much for that. I mean, as far as history is concerned, Gandhi, there's more than one reason why he disapproves of it, and I named two. One is that it served as justification for colonialism, and second, that it got to be the primary instrument in the making of violent identities, right? To this day, we have quarrels over historical issues in this country, and for Gandhi, these are foolish. Who are you to identify with or to hate people who died hundreds of years ago? So those are two ways in which he disapproves of it. But he also says in Hind Swaraj and elsewhere that history is only a record of violence, all right? And that non-violence therefore does not have a history. It is quotidian, it is everyday. It cannot be grasped by historical knowledge. Now, of course, in our days, historians might object and say, no, you can have a history of the everyday. But perhaps for Gandhi, this would be simply quixotic. It would be a way of trying to exceptionalize the unexceptional. He said histories in which the way they've been traditionally written have been about violence. Kings are fighting battles and so on. People are doing such and such. What sustains the world is not violence, though. It's non-violence. So his argument always is that if we have all survived, if societies have flourished, if villages continue to exist, it is because despite those acts of violence, people live together and they must live non-violently. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. They wouldn't interact with each other, right? But this is invisible. I think he wants it to remain invisible in some senses. If history is a way of making things visible in a record, for Gandhi, for all the reasons I have suggested, that record is highly problematic. And he would rather that we attend to the everydayness of non-violence and its sacrificial forms. Right? So that's as far as history is. Yes, of course, as far as the West and my characterization of it is concerned, I was using it, as I said, as a foil. There's much more going on in European moral thought than what I suggested. But in a rather general way, I think it is possible to say that one of the innovations of Gandhi's thinking is precisely that he does not concern himself with choice in the way that I described it, with the knowledge upon which it must be founded, and with the limitations of violence, the limitation of morality when face to face with violence. And so the only way I could foreground this, the innovative nature of Gandhi's approach to the problem, was to make a foil out of something called European moral thought. Of course, in his time, that was largely true, but let us not forget that Gandhi's deepest influences many of his deepest influences are from European thinkers. The chief one being Tolstoy, right? Tolstoy, the Christian thinker, the kingdom of God is within you, right? And of course there are others, but Tolstoy is really and he has of course a famous correspondence with Tolstoy as well. So, as I also suggested earlier, Gandhi himself is clear that though he thinks India has a mission for the world, he doesn't think his idea of morality is peculiar to India. He would be shocked by it, right? He would think that if India has a mission for the world, that means that, that mission is necessarily universal. So when, for instance, he's describing Satyagraha, which is a term that he himself comes up with help, right? He initially describes it when talking about how Boer women, Afrikaner women, during the Boer War in South Africa, who had been put into British concentration camps, how they behaved. So again, it is women, not men, who are the great moral exemplars here. And it's not even Indian women. It's not even in India. It's in South Africa. And this is this characterizes his universalistic approach. And yet it's a curious kind of universality because, of course, it's not generic, as I was suggesting. That because of Swadharma, it was particular in every instance, though you could learn from it, right? Now, I think Gandhi is a very coherent thinker. Often we try to excuse his apparent aberrations or contradictions by saying, oh, he's full of contradictions and he himself said it. But compared to most thinkers, he's actually very coherent. He's tenacious. He stays with the thought. Like his thoughts on war, for 30 years, he's thinking about them. He's not like the run-of-the-mill politician, one day he'll do one thing and some other day something else will happen. He stays with it. He worries it. He's a very coherent figure. But of course, no thinker has worked out absolutely everything. But even there, Gandhi is, because he gives so much pride of place to the incalculable as the avataran, he is already, as it were, prefigured it. Right? So that it's almost as if his form of thinking is a way, it's kind of embroidery around and a kind of invitation to the divine, invitation to the incarnation of divinity. And that's where he is really quite religious as a thinker. And yet at the same time, of course, that religiosity can be explained in purely secular philosophical terms, because you can describe it as I have just described it, as a philosophical recognition of the incalculable and a way of attending upon it. You can have that explanation, or you can have the purely religious explanation that Gandhi also gives you of the incarnation. And both are equal. And Gandhi, of course, spent his career talking in these kinds of levels, which is why he has been so misunderstood. Because he explains things to people depending on their, not understanding, depending on their intention, since you ended with intention. So he would always say of the Congress, for instance, in 47, when it comes to the decision on partition, and Congress asks him, come and help us decide. And he says to them, it's a famous, wonderfully evocative meeting, and his speech is marvelous. He says, you have asked me to come and make a decision on whether we should partition India or not, but you have already made that decision. Basically, you want me to rubber stamp that decision. I have always been against the partition of India, but you have never believed in non-violence as a principle. For you, it has always only been a tactic, right? You have always, in fact, been wedded to violence. So, because you have never truly believed in non-violence as a principle, my advice to you has always been at your level, what you wanted, your intentionality. Because something is better than nothing. I don't expect everyone to agree with me. But non-violence is still possible. If you believed in non-violence as a principle, you would rather see India in a civil war than partition India, because the consequences of that will be irreversible. So that is one way in which he figured intentionality.
Okay, final. Yeah.
Your lecture gave us a new light to look at the violence which happened during the times of Gandhi, why he allowed it. But as I remember, that is fine, but Almora, where he has written commentary on Gita rather than, and it is named as Anasakti Yoga. So Karma Yoga is important, but much important for Tilak rather than Gandhi. But he gave much importance to unattachment or disinterested Karma Yoga. That what you brought out, fruit in future. So will you emphasize on non-attachment or Karma Yoga, or both?
Thank you very much. You're quite correct, of course. And I've been dealing in this lecture only with the 1926 commentary. But the book, of course, Anashakti Yoga, is a very important one. And Gandhi has many other writings on the Gita. You are right that he by no means dismisses the other forms of practice of yoga, of which bhakti is also very, very important. And that's where his emphasis on Ram Nam and all comes from, Ramdun and all comes from that end of things. I would agree with you that I think it's the detachment or the disinterested action that is crucial for Gandhi. I have been stressing the action part of it because I wanted to put Gandhi into a kind of conversation with his peers, to show how Gandhi belonged to his time as well as exceeding it. And that if we are to understand Gandhi's commentaries on the Gita alongside those of Tilak or Aurobindo or Bankim or Vivekanand or Vinoba Bhave or whoever, and there are many more, what might be the thread or one of the threads connecting them. And that, I wanted to argue, was in a colonial situation, the impossibility of owning your own political action made them think about action in a rather different way. I always thought it strange that here are all these figures who are thinking about war, about the battlefield, at a time when there is no violent resistance, no serious violent resistance to the British. In fact, Indians are cooperating with the British, which is why Gandhi stresses non-cooperation. Right? So it's somewhat ironic, if not paradoxical, that everyone is focusing on violence and on the battlefield of the Gita, while in reality, Congress and others are doing constitutional business in the Raj, even though they resist it. So I tend to think that the battlefield and the figure of karma, of action, looms large in this context and becomes significant in this context, which is why I stressed it. But as I said, I agree that it is, in terms of its philosophical weight, it is disinterested action that is crucial for Gandhi, because all other things flow from it. The suspicion of future-oriented action, the attachment to the present, the attending upon the incalculable or the divine incarnation, the role of the child as the exemplary moral figure, all the things that I've spoken of come out of that one fundamental aspect of it, which is Nishkam Karma.
Thank you, Professor Devji, on behalf of Mani Bhavan, on behalf of all who are present today, for this excellent, scintillating talk. We hope to see you more often at Mani Bhavan as and when you visit India. And thank you all for coming here and making it a successful program.